A continent of ice should be silent, yet Antarctica is louder in mystery than any jungle or desert on Earth. Beneath its frozen skin lie mountains taller than the Alps, lakes sealed for millions of years, and fossils that rewrite the story of life itself. Explorers who braved its white void returned with tales of shifting lights, magnetic anomalies, and landscapes that feel older than the sky. Even today, satellites glimpse shapes hidden under ice no sun has touched. Antarctica remains the last great question mark on the map, a reminder that Earth still keeps secrets deeper than imagination. Before the world froze, Antarctica was alive. Not the blinding wasteland of white we know, but a continent of rivers, ferns, and forests that swayed under a sun that never truly set. The air shimmered with warmth. Amphibians stirred in swamps where glaciers now crush stone. Somewhere beneath 4 kilometers of ice, that green world still lingers, fossilized, waiting, perfectly preserved in silence. It began long before humanity, in the age when the continents themselves were children. Nearly 500 million years ago, the Earth was still gathering its pieces. Land masses drifted and collided, fusing into one vast southern supercontinent, Gondwana. It was immense, a quilt of what would one day become South America, Africa, India, Australia, and the great land at the world's bottom. In those prehistoric days, Antarctica was not a lonely pole of ice, but the beating heart of a living planet. Through deep time, the southern world pulsed with warmth. Rivers ran through fertile plains. Marshlands steamed under a thick, oxygen-rich sky. Across them spread the Glossopteris forests, vast stands of seed ferns whose roots dug deep into black soil. Fossilized leaves from those trees, found today locked in rock near the South Pole, still show their delicate veins, silent testimony that what is now frozen was once fertile. These forests were not lonely. Early reptiles, ancestors of creatures that would one day dominate the planet, stalked through fern groves, leaving faint trails in soft mud. Amphibians croaked in wetlands fed by warm rain, and primitive mammals nested in hollows beneath moss. The air carried the scent of resin, not salt. Antarctica was green, humid, alive. But continents, like empires and civilizations, are never still. Beneath that lush surface, forces older than life were stirring. The crust of the earth, immense slabs of stone floating upon molten rock, began to drift apart. Over millions of years, Gondwana cracked. Rifts split the land, tearing deep into what would become the Indian and Atlantic Oceans. Antarctica, once central, began to drift southward, a slow exile that would last tens of millions of years. At first, little changed. Even as it wandered toward the pole, the world was still warmer than today. Life clung to the coasts. Forests spread even as the sunlight dimmed. But by the late Eocene, the planet itself began to shift. Volcanic activity and continental rearrangement altered ocean currents. Warm water no longer reached the far south. The first snow fell that did not melt. Then came the event that sealed the continent's fate. As South America and Australia pulled fully away, a ring of open water formed around Antarctica. That ring gave birth to a current, the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, a river of icy ocean encircling the world's southernmost land. It trapped Antarctica in a circle of cold, cutting it off from the warmth of the tropics. Within a few million years, glaciers formed. They thickened, they spread. The last forests vanished beneath the advancing white. This was not a single winter. It was a slow burial. Each century added another thin layer of snow. Each millennium another stratum of compressed ice. Rivers froze in their beds. Mountains disappeared beneath endless frost. The land sank under the weight. In time, even the memory of warmth seemed to vanish. Yet the Earth remembers everything. Hidden deep within Antarctica's ice are bubbles of ancient air, tiny archives of the world that came before. Scientists drilling ice cores at Vostok and Dome Sea have drawn up samples older than human civilization, capturing snapshots of long-dead climates. Within those transparent cylinders, the planet's pulse is still beating. The gases of ancient forests, the ashes of prehistoric fires, the breath of a world that once flourished at the pole. Beneath that ice, radar surveys have revealed something astonishing. The buried bones of a continent still intact. Mountain ranges as tall as the Alps lie hidden under the East Antarctic ice sheet, their peaks unseen for 30 million years. Valleys stretch for hundreds of kilometers, once carved by rivers that no longer flow. Basins the size of small countries remain sealed under kilometers of ice, their shapes traced only by sound and gravity. In a sense, the real Antarctica, the living one, is still there, entombed and unreachable. Every discovery deepens the mystery. The more scientists uncover, the more they realize how little we know of the land below. Beneath the ice lies a secret world, subglacial lakes that have been sealed off from the atmosphere for up to 25 million years. Some are as vast as inland seas. The most famous, Lake Vostok, lies under 4 kilometers of ice, a liquid body so ancient that its waters may hold microbes that evolved in total isolation, cut off from the sun since before humanity existed. Such revelations ignite both science and imagination. If entire mountain ranges, valleys, and ecosystems can hide under ice, what else might be there? The mind begins to wander. Could remnants of that ancient green age still remain? Not just fossilized, but preserved? Could ruins lie frozen in those valleys, the remnants of civilizations erased when the continent froze? No evidence proves such things. Yet stories persist, stories that began long before radar and drilling rigs. In the age of exploration, mapmakers filled the unknown with dreams. The Greeks spoke of terra australis incognita, a vast southern land meant to balance the continents of the north. It was not a discovery. It was a philosophy, a belief that the world must be symmetrical, that for every known there must be an unknown. That idea survived for centuries, painted on parchment as an enormous continent at the bottom of every map. As explorers ventured farther, the myth evolved. Some imagined that this southern land was not merely balance, but refuge, the last remnant of a lost civilization. When Plato wrote of Atlantis, destroyed by water and fire, some later thinkers placed its remnants beneath the southern ice. When Renaissance cartographers, like Piri Reis, drew coastlines that seemed to match Antarctica's shape, long before its discovery, imagination took hold. Did someone, long ago, see it before it froze? Did a civilization map the world in its primeval form, when polar forests still thrived? Modern science dismisses such claims as coincidence or conjecture, yet their endurance says something deeper. Antarctica resists certainty. It is the only continent where myth and measurement coexist without cancelling each other out. Beneath its ice, both data and dream survive. Even now, satellite images capture geometric shapes that appear too regular to be natural. Sharp ridges that resemble pyramids, dark openings that look like gateways in the ice. Scientists explain them as natural formations, nunataks, peaks of rock sculpted by erosion, or meltwater caverns widened by shifting winds. But explanations never silence curiosity. Each photograph sparks another theory, another whisper of something more deliberate hiding below. It is human nature to fill the blank spaces of our world with stories. When explorers reached the poles, they found not monsters, but silence. And perhaps that silence is even harder to endure. The mind begins to hear its own echoes, to imagine voices beneath the ice. Could the myths of hollow earths and forgotten cities be our way of giving form to that emptiness? Perhaps we need the idea of hidden worlds, because the real one feels too empty. Still, sometimes myth brushes close to truth. When the first fossils of Antarctic forests were discovered in 1912, leaves, branches, and tree trunks found near the Beardmore Glacier, they confirmed what no one had dared to imagine. This continent had once been warm. In that moment, the legends of a lost green Antarctica gained a strange new legitimacy. It was as though myth had been speaking in metaphor all along. The paradise under the ice turned out to be real, not of marble and gold, but of roots and leaves turned to stone. In every age, the southern land has reflected human desire. For ancient philosophers, it was the proof that the world was balanced. For explorers, it was the final frontier. For dreamers and mystics, it became the resting place of all things forgotten. The cradle of Atlantis, the vault of gods, the mirror of the unknown. For scientists, it is a record of the planet's past and a warning of its future. Each interpretation overlays the last like snow upon snow. Perhaps that is Antarctica's truest mystery. It reveals only what we are ready to see. When we look at it, we see our own age reflected in ice, ambition, fear, wonder, the hunger to find meaning where none may exist. Every expedition south, every core sample drilled, every legend whispered over maps and microphones is part of a single story, the human refusal to accept emptiness. Today, beneath the white horizon, the same buried rivers and valleys still lie untouched. The ice above them continues to thicken and move, reshaping the surface even as it preserves what lies below. Somewhere under that pressure, forests sleep, their carbon frozen into crystal seams. Mountain ranges stand silent beneath the dark, and as climate change begins to peel back the continent's outer edges, fragments of that ancient world return. Fossil wood, pollen, the faint ghosts of greenery. Antarctica is not a dead continent. It is a paused one. Every gust of polar wind that sweeps across its plains is the echo of a world that once breathed warmth. The ice does not destroy, it conceals. And like all veils, it invites wonder and fear at what might be unveiled when it finally begins to melt. In the end, Antarctica is more than the sum of its glaciers and storms. It is a memory made solid, the Earth's most perfect secret. A bridge between science and myth, between what we know and what we can only imagine. Beneath its frozen silence lies the truth of deep time, that nothing is ever truly gone, only hidden long enough to be mistaken for legend. And as the ice cracks and ancient air escapes in faint sighs, the continent whispers the same message to those who dare to listen. The world was warm once. It will be warm again. Every ridge that slumbers under the ice, every buried riverbed and fossil vein, is part of a record older than bone or breath. Deep beneath Antarctica's frozen shell lies the trace of a world that was once whole. The place where the southern landmass of Gondwana began to break apart. Around 180 million years ago, the planet's inner heat gathered strength beneath what would one day be the South Pole. Pressure built until the crust split open. Lava surged upward, flooding plains of fern and forest. The air thickened with volcanic ash. The sea turned dark with minerals drawn from the deep. This was the slow unmaking of Gondwana, a continental separation that would give birth to the world's modern shape. Antarctica, still green then, drifted steadily southward toward the long twilight of the pole. The creatures that walked this land witnessed its transformation. In the age of dinosaurs, herds of small feathered reptiles wandered through polar valleys carpeted in moss and cycads. Fossil evidence from the Antarctic peninsula reveals that they adapted to long months of dusk, their bodies tuned to the rhythm of half-lit winters. The forests around them endured too, though they grew differently. Trees without rings, shaped by the endless summer light and the brief, muted cold. As eons passed, the land folded and lifted again. New mountains rose from the buried edges of the ancient plateau. The colossal Transantarctic Range, a spine of stone more than 3,000 kilometers long. It split the continent in two, the vast ancient East and the younger volcanic West. Even now, that divide endures, the slow boundary between stability and fire. Beneath the thick ice sheet, the crust still moves. Satellites track subtle tremors, the slow creep of glaciers across faults millions of years old. The ice behaves like a living thing, sliding, fracturing, sealing itself again. Deep radar imaging shows subglacial lakes and rivers, whole networks of liquid water flowing unseen under the frozen crust. These hidden waterways drain and refill over time, like a pulse in the planet's body. Within them, life endures in microscopic form, extremophiles that feed on minerals and darkness, proof that existence can cling even to silence. Scientists speak of these discoveries in precise terms, but each one deepens the mystery. Beneath the eastern plateau lies a region called Wilkes Land, where instruments have detected a massive gravitational disturbance, a dense structure buried beneath 2 miles of ice. Its shape resembles the signature of a crater, perhaps the scar of a colossal impact hundreds of millions of years ago. Some believe it marks the asteroid that helped end the Permian Age, the planet's greatest extinction. Others see in it something less easily defined, a remnant of the mantle, a rise of stone shaped by forces unknown. Imagination, as always, rushes to fill the gaps left by evidence. The gravitational anomaly, the hidden lakes, the untouched valleys, each new revelation feeds the old question of what might lie below. There are whispers of a buried city, of a vault left by an earlier civilization, of gateways leading downward into a hollow world. These are not findings, only echoes of curiosity given mythic form, but their persistence says something profound about the nature of mystery. When the world withholds its secrets, the mind invents its own. Even science cannot resist a touch of wonder here. The continent behaves like a paradox, frozen on the surface, volcanic beneath. Beneath the western ice sheet, geothermal vents release heat that softens the glaciers from below. Entire ranges of volcanoes remain active, their peaks unseen, their presence known only by faint plumes of gas caught by sensors. Antarctica, outwardly lifeless, conceals a restless heart. At the same time, its atmosphere holds traces of its green past. Within the layers of compacted snow, researchers have found pollen, spores, and fragments of ancient plant life, ghostly evidence that this was once a place of color. Each discovery brings the past a little closer, though never enough to touch. Antarctica offers glimpses, never answers. As the land drifted fully into its polar orbit, isolation sealed its fate. The Antarctic circumpolar current, that endless band of ocean, encircled the continent like a moat. Warm currents could no longer reach its shores. Ice thickened year after year, binding the mountains, entombing the valleys, pressing the old forests into coal. The last temperate winds faded, replaced by cold storms that have not stopped since. And yet, something of the old world remains beneath the frost. Radar mapping has revealed entire ancient landscapes under the ice. Rolling hills, branching rivers, the imprint of deltas that once met open seas. Some of these frozen features are so well preserved that scientists can reconstruct the shadows of trees that vanished 30 million years ago. It is as though the Earth itself placed its memories under glass, keeping them safe from time. This paradox, preservation through destruction, is what gives Antarctica its power. It is both tomb and archive, ruin and record. Every storm that sweeps its surface, every layer of snow that falls, adds another page to a story still being written in silence. The more the ice hides, the more it holds. Perhaps that is why human imagination cannot let it rest. Legends of lost cities beneath the pole may never be proven, yet they mirror the truth that lies just beneath the surface. There was once a thriving world here, full of life and motion, erased not by war or flood, but by the slow turning of the planet itself. If Gondwana was the cradle of the southern world, Antarctica became its memory, a continent that carries the proof of everything the Earth has been, and the promise of what it may become again. The ice sheet, vast and indifferent, continues to drift outward into the Southern Ocean, but beneath it, the buried ranges and silent lakes remain. They wait as they have always waited, patient, untouched, recording every subtle tremor, every whisper of heat from the core below. One day, when the planet's balance shifts again and the ice begins to recede, those landscapes will awaken to the light. Then the past will surface, slow and dazzling. Forests turn to stone, rivers return to water, perhaps even creatures that have slept since the world was young. The veil will lift as it has before, and the forgotten heart of Gondwana will beat once more beneath the southern sun. Before explorers traced their roots into the ice, the idea of a southern world already existed, not as a continent, but as a conviction. Ancient philosophers, gazing at the shape of the known Earth, imagined that balance required symmetry. If there were lands in the north, there must be lands in the south. The Greeks called it Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land, a vast counterweight beneath the seas, invisible yet necessary for the harmony of the world. This belief was not born from maps, but from thought itself. In the 2nd century AD, the astronomer Ptolemy gave it form. His Geographia drew the limits of the world as it was known to Rome, and reasoned that a great mass of land must exist below the equator to prevent the globe from tipping. The southern realm became part of the intellectual fabric of antiquity, unseen but undeniable. From Alexandria to Constantinople, the scholars of the Mediterranean carried the idea forward through centuries of copying and interpretation. The world was ordered by logic, and logic insisted that a southern continent waited beyond the reach of human sight. Later ages inherited both the theory and its allure. In the early Islamic Golden Age, cartographers and scholars reinterpreted Ptolemy's model through the lens of their own expanding horizons. Navigators of the Abbasid Caliphate and merchants of the Indian Ocean spoke of lands far beyond the known islands of the East, places of fierce sun and endless sand where the sky itself seemed to bend. The geographer Al-Khwarizmi, writing in the 9th century, included a southern world on his maps, though no traveller had ever touched its soil. To him, it was both geography and metaphor, the reflection of divine balance between light and shadow, known and unknown. For the medieval mind, the edges of the map were places where reason gave way to wonder. Travelers' tales from India, Africa, and the South Seas carried fragments of rumor that fed the southern myth. Some spoke of a burning land at the bottom of the world, a realm of perpetual day where the ground was too hot to walk upon. Others insisted that the southern world was paradise itself, unfallen and untouched, where air and light met in perfect peace. In an age before the compass was common and the horizon was still a mystery, imagination filled the void more powerfully than evidence ever could. By the time of the Renaissance, Europe's hunger for knowledge had turned the world into a canvas of speculation. New maps appeared, beautiful, fragile works of ink and philosophy, in which the outlines of real continents bled into dreams. Among the most enduring was the Piri Reis map of 1513, drawn by an Ottoman admiral who compiled information from older sources. On its lower edge, curving beneath South America, lies a coastline that seems eerily familiar. Some believe it resembles the northern shore of Antarctica, drawn centuries before the continent's discovery. Scholars have debated that map for generations. Its defenders argue that it preserves fragments of a forgotten survey, the work of an ancient seafaring civilization that mapped the Earth in an age before ice critics dismiss it as coincidence, a misinterpretation of the South American coast, distorted by limited knowledge. Yet even the most cautious observer cannot help noticing how carefully Piri Reis labelled his world. Islands that were real beside coasts that could not yet be known, legends and measurements coexisting on the same page. The Orontius Phineas map of 1531 followed, showing a southern landmass almost identical in position to Antarctica, complete with rivers, mountain ranges, and a curving shoreline free of ice. Later came Mercator, whose 1569 projection placed the same land at the world's base like a foundation stone. To modern eyes, these drawings seem fanciful, but to their makers, they were logical extensions of inherited truth. The southern world existed because it must. Absence of proof was no refutation. For the philosophers of that era, the idea carried symbolic weight. The South was not simply the opposite of the North. It was the complement, the hidden twin that completed creation. Some theologians saw it as a mirror of Eden, a land preserved from the flood, untouched by sin or civilization. Others imagined it as the abode of monsters and demons, the shadow world below the known. In both visions, paradise or perdition, the southern land was the place where human order ended and cosmic balance began. This blending of fact and faith shaped the earliest European voyages beyond the equator. When Portuguese and Spanish sailors crossed into the unknown seas, they carried more than instruments and banners. They carried centuries of expectation. Every island they found seemed a fragment of the greater land promised by philosophy. When they mapped coasts in the Indies or charted new archipelagos, the outlines bent toward the myth they sought to prove. It is easy, with hindsight, to see how imagination guided the compass as much as magnetism did. Each discovery was read as confirmation that the world still hid a southern continent waiting to be revealed. In that sense, the myth of Terra Australis was not false. It was simply larger than its reality. As centuries passed, the shape of the world grew clearer. The voyages of Magellan, Drake, and Tasman began to redraw the edges of the Earth, replacing speculation with coastlines and distances. Yet even as the maps filled, the idea of a southern mystery refused to vanish. The more the explorers saw, the more they felt what they could not reach. The Antarctic seas, violent, fog-drenched, littered with ice, became the physical embodiment of that distance between belief and proof. In this way, The myth transformed. It ceased to be a matter of geography and became something deeper, a reflection of how humanity confronts the unseen. The southern land that philosophers imagined became the realm of possibility itself, the horizon that forever recedes as knowledge expands. Still, traces of those older beliefs lingered in every chart, every sailor's tale, every speculation whispered over parchment. The white space at the bottom of the map remained, and within it the promise of revelation. When the first explorers finally set their sails southward, they were not simply chasing new trade routes or glory. They were pursuing the ghost of an idea older than any nation. That ghost waited at the world's end, a mirage of warmth hidden beneath storms, the imagined twin of the known Earth. Soon, men would attempt to find it. When the early navigators turned their eyes south, they were not chasing profit alone. They were chasing belief. For more than 1,000 years, the terra australis of philosophy had survived untouched by evidence, carried forward not by explorers, but by mapmakers and dreamers who refused to let the world be smaller than imagination. By the 16th century, maps had become the theatre of wonder. Cartographers were part scientist, part storyteller, their pens drawing coastlines that mixed knowledge and hope in equal measure. The blank spaces at the edge of the parchment were never left empty. They were invitations. Here, they implied, is where the story continues. Among these cartographers, the French scholar Orontius Phineas stands as a curious figure. In 1531, he published a world map showing a southern land that bears a haunting resemblance to modern Antarctica, complete with bays, mountain ranges, and river valleys that seem to follow the outlines revealed by satellites centuries later. Some researchers have suggested that Phineas's sources may have included ancient maps now lost, perhaps inherited through medieval libraries or Arab navigators. Others see only coincidence, the result of artistic symmetry. Yet the precision with which he placed the land, south of Africa, stretching beneath the Pacific, still unsettles historians. The Phineas map, like the later projection of Gerardus Mercator, became an artifact of speculation. It drew lines between continents that no ship had ever crossed, and in doing so, it bridged myth and geography. To those who studied it, the southern continent seemed less a fantasy than a memory, a fragment of knowledge preserved from some forgotten age. The question was not whether Terra Australis existed, but how much of it remained hidden. Even the most skeptical scholars of the Renaissance could not resist that possibility. When they spoke of lost wisdom, they did not always mean religion or philosophy. They meant maps, the ancient science of knowing the world through shape. If an earlier civilization had surveyed the planet before the rise of Europe, then its memory might live on in the fragments of parchment that survived the centuries. In this sense, each rediscovered map was treated almost like scripture, a revelation pointing toward a buried truth. The mystique deepened when navigators began to encounter strange anomalies in their voyages. As ships ventured farther south into the Indian Ocean, they recorded shifting magnetic readings, distorted compass bearings, and mirages that glowed at the horizon like islands of light. These phenomena were natural, the effects of geomagnetism and the play of sun on mist. Yet to the sailors of the 16th century, they seemed like signs of something powerful lurking beyond reach. In taverns and ports from Lisbon to Venice, tales spread of a continent made of flame and crystal, a place where the sea itself smoked and the air shimmered with heat. Some said it was the domain of the fallen angels driven from the north. Others swore it was the refuge of the first race of humankind, preserved from the flood. Poets imagined its mountains gleaming under twin suns. its valleys filled with golden birds. In every version, the southern world was both promise and punishment, a paradise concealed behind peril. Even the church could not decide what to make of it. Theologians argued whether the antipodes, people living opposite to the known world, could exist without violating scripture. If men inhabited that far southern land, did they descend from Adam? Did the flood reach them? The questions blurred the boundaries between theology and geography until both became mirrors of the same curiosity. How much of creation remained unknown? By the time of Peary Rice, Phineas, and Mercator, myth and mathematics had fused completely. To draw the world was to shape its meaning. The cartographer's ink carried authority that no explorer could rival. When they sketched a coastline, it became real by virtue of being believed. And so, even before a single keel cut through the polar fog, the outlines of Antarctica already existed, not on Earth, but in the collective imagination of humankind. The fascination endured because it spoke to something universal. The world, newly expanded by discovery, still needed mystery. The North had its auroras, its Norse sagas, its frozen gods. The South became its echo, a land of inversion where warmth and cold, light and dark, faith and doubt all met at the edge of the map. Over the next 2 centuries, explorers would continue to chase that silhouette at the world's end. Portuguese caravels, Dutch merchant ships, British whalers, all pushed beyond the known latitudes, expecting at any moment to find the shores of the hidden continent. What they met instead was the endless storm of the Southern Ocean. Waves that towered higher than masts. Wind that screamed like stone grinding on stone. Skies split by lightning reflected on ice. Many turned back, convinced that the land of legend must lie farther still. Others vanished into fog, their ships carried into the white. In their absence, imagination did what it always does. It filled the silence. Each failure became proof that the southern land existed, because something vast and forbidding had to be guarding it. That cycle of search and belief would continue into the modern age. By the 18th century, science had replaced theology as the language of mystery, yet the yearning remained unchanged. Philosophers spoke of the poles as the lungs of the planet, breathing cold into the world to preserve its balance. Artists painted Antarctica as a mirror of heaven, a landscape untouched by the fall of man. And beneath these interpretations, the old myth endured, reshaped but not erased. Terra Australis was no longer the theoretical counterweight of Ptolemy's globe. It had become the symbol of everything still hidden. The human need for frontiers, the hunger to believe that beyond the final horizon lies something more. Soon, ships would sail into that myth and tear it open. They would find not paradise nor hell, but a realm stranger still, a continent of pure silence where imagination and reality collided, and where the line between discovery and belief would blur forever. Southern Horizon haunted human maps for centuries, way before any ship dared to chase it. When the age of myth gave way to the age of sail, the world's oceans became the new frontiers of faith. Terra Australis, the imagined southern land, was no longer an idea drawn in ink. It was a promise waiting beyond the storms. The first to reach for it were the explorers of empire. In 1519, Ferdinand Magellan set out to circle the globe under the banner of Spain. When his fleet crossed the narrow passage at the tip of South America, later named the Strait of Magellan, the waters opened into an ocean so vast and calm that he called it Mar Pacifico. To the men on his ships, the calm was deceptive. Somewhere beyond the horizon, they believed, stretched the coast of the great southern continent that Ptolemy and the Renaissance maps had foretold. They did not find it. What they found instead was a silence so immense it felt divine. A sea without shore, a void that swallowed direction itself. After Magellan came Francis Drake, sailing under the English flag half a century later. His voyage southward in 1578 would mark a moment of revelation and despair. Driven by storms past the Strait of Magellan, Drake's ships were cast into open ocean. They found no land, no sheltered bay, only an endless wall of waves. It was here that the last illusion began to dissolve. The southern world was not a mirror of the north, lush and symmetrical. It was a vast expanse of water and wind, and beyond it, the beginning of the unknown. Even then, belief did not fade easily. The Dutch navigator Abel Tasman would sail in the 1640s with orders to claim new lands for the Netherlands and to locate the long-suspected southern continent. His voyage charted Tasmania and the western coasts of New Zealand, places so remote and strange that his crew convinced themselves they had found the edge of the world. They had, in a sense, but it was only the northern fringe of the true Antarctica, still hidden beyond the horizon. Each new expedition carved away at the myth, yet the mystery persisted. For every stretch of empty ocean discovered, mapmakers drew another imaginary shore farther south. The farther they traveled, the more they convinced themselves that the real continent must lie just beyond reach. That tension between discovery and belief defined the next 2 centuries of exploration. By the 1770s, the world was ready for a reckoning. The Enlightenment had turned curiosity into duty. Exploration was no longer only conquest or commerce. It was an experiment in reason. When Captain James Cook received orders from the British Admiralty to test the truth of the southern continent, he carried with him instruments for measuring the stars, thermometers for gauging the air, and the weight of centuries of speculation. His mission was clear: to find or disprove the existence of Terra Australis once and for all. In December 1772, Cook's 2 ships, the Resolution and the Adventure, left the Cape of Good Hope and sailed south into a fog so thick it seemed to swallow time. Icebergs rose from the water like mountains. The sea itself turned to slush. The masts creaked with frost. Days blurred into nights of spectral light as the men entered latitudes no one had crossed before. On January 17, 1773, Cook's expedition became the first to cross the Antarctic Circle, breaking through the invisible line that had divided myth from reality. What they found was not a continent, but a wall, a barrier of ice stretching across the horizon as far as any spyglass could see. Cook described it as an obstruction of nature itself, a frozen barricade between the known world and whatever lay beyond. His crew watched as glaciers carved into the sea with thunderous cracks, the sound echoing across the stillness like cannon fire. For weeks they searched for a passage through, sailing east along the ice edge. None appeared. When Cook finally turned north, he wrote that if any land existed beyond that barrier, it must be a country doomed by nature to perpetual frigidness, never to be inhabited by man. Yet even in his failure, he confirmed a truth greater than the myth he disproved. The southern world was real. It existed, even if it was not the paradise men had imagined. The dream of Terra Australis had not died. It had simply changed shape. In the decades that followed, the oceans south of the known continents became highways of obsession. Whalers and sealers, driven by profit rather than philosophy, pushed farther into the icy seas than any explorer before them. Theirs was not the pursuit of knowledge, but survival. hunting the creatures that thrived in the cold darkness. Yet their crude maps and journals would open the way for science. By the early 19th century, rumors spread among sailors of distant islands rising from the fog. Black cliffs, volcanic peaks, coastlines glimpsed between gales. The South Shetland Islands were charted in 1819, followed by the South Orkneys and South Sandwich Islands, each new discovery dragging the boundary of the known world a little closer to the pole. And then, in 1820, the veil lifted. 3 separate expeditions, Russian, British, and American, each claimed to have sighted the Antarctic mainland within weeks of one another. The Russian captain, Fabian Gottlieb von Bellingshausen, sailing aboard the Vostok, recorded a faint line of ice-covered coast. The British navigator, Edward Bransfield, approaching from the opposite direction, reported mountains shimmering beyond the sea mist. And the American sealer, Nathaniel Palmer, driven by instinct and chance, described a stretch of land so vast that it seemed to merge with the sky. None could have known that they were gazing upon the same thing, the last continent finally revealed. The discovery did not end the mystery. In some ways, it deepened it. The continent they found was not the lush counterweight of old maps, nor a world of eternal fire. It was a place stripped bare of all life, as though creation itself had paused there. Men who stood at the edge of that icy frontier wrote of a silence so profound that it unsettled their minds. They spoke of mirages dancing across the horizon, mountains that appeared and vanished, cities of light refracted through the frozen air. The same imagination that had once painted Terra Australis now turned those distortions into legends, lost realms beneath the ice, gateways to hidden seas, spirits of the pole. As the 19th century dawned, the myth and the map finally shared the same space. The last empty corner of the earth had been found, but understanding it would take generations. The sailors who had chased gold and glory were replaced by men of endurance, surveyors, naturalists, and dreamers who came not to conquer, but to comprehend. They carried instruments instead of weapons, notebooks instead of banners. And as they crossed the threshold into that frozen silence, they carried with them something far older than any scientific ambition, the same hunger that had driven Ptolemy to balance the globe and Phineas to draw impossible coasts. The world, even in the age of reason, still needed mystery. Antarctica would give it that in abundance. When the 19th century began, the age of myth had not yet surrendered to the age of reason. The southern continent was no longer the paradise of philosophers, nor the flaming inferno of sailors' tales, but a riddle made real, a land glimpsed yet unexplored. Those who sailed for its horizon spoke of it not as a destination, but as an edge, the boundary between the world of men and the realm of the unanswerable. Whaling ships and sealing crews were the first to trespass upon this threshold. They were not scholars or scientists. They were pragmatists, hardened by hunger and the smell of salt and oil. Their vessels, small and creaking, were drawn ever farther south in search of new waters to exploit. It was they who mapped the scattered islands that guarded Antarctica's frozen heart. The South Shetlands, the South Orkneys, and the lonely peaks of the South Sandwich Islands. Each new land was claimed, then abandoned, left to vanish again beneath the snow. The journals of those crews read like a blend of ledger and lament. They speak of fog so thick the sea vanished beneath their bows, of weeks without stars, of birds that circled endlessly as if trapped in their own migration. Some of the men swore that the ice moved with intention, that it groaned and split like a living thing. Others told of lights on the horizon, pale glows that rose and fell behind the fog, too steady for lightning and too silent for flame. In ports across the Atlantic, such tales grew into superstition that Antarctica was not merely a continent, but a threshold between worlds. Yet amid those ghost stories, the first steps towards science were taken. By the 1820s, explorers no longer sailed for myth alone. The world's great powers had begun to sense the value of knowledge itself, the prestige of discovery, the authority of mapping the unknown. Expeditions were funded not by merchants, but by governments, each eager to plant its flag at the planet's edge. The British, with their tradition of maritime ambition, were among the first to turn rumour into reconnaissance. Captain James Weddell, a reserved and meticulous navigator, sailed south in 1823 aboard the Jane. His logbook records weather, ice, and silence, nothing of monsters or golden continents, only the steady rhythm of wind and wave. Pushing farther than any before him, Weddell reached 74·15 decust south, into waters so empty that the men began to fear they had sailed off the map. He found no land, but the stretch of sea that bears his name remains one of the loneliest on Earth. Elsewhere, other nations joined the search. In 1838, the French explorer Jules Dumont d'Urville led an expedition that confirmed the existence of solid ground south of the polar circle. His men named it Terre Adélie, after his wife, a small gesture of warmth in a world of endless cold. Around the same time, American naval officer Charles Wilkes commanded 6 ships through perilous ice. He charted hundreds of miles of coastline, later vindicated by satellite as part of the East Antarctic shore. Though many doubted him at the time, his journey laid the foundation for the continent's true outline. But it was the British expedition of 1839-1843, led by James Clark Ross, that transformed Antarctica from rumour into revelation. Ross had already explored the Arctic. He understood cold not as emptiness, but as resistance. With his ships Erebus and Terror, names that seemed prophetic, he sailed deep into the southern latitudes. There, through storms and weeks of darkness, his crew witnessed sights that defied language. They saw a mountain rising straight from the sea, its peak wreathed in smoke and fire, a volcano in a land of ice. Ross named it Mount Erebus for his ship, and beside it another extinct twin, Mount Terror. They discovered the immense Ross ice shelf, a barrier of frozen ocean hundreds of meters high and stretching farther than the eye could see. To stand before it was to face time made solid. Ross recorded his wonder with the restraint of a man too awed to embellish. The most stupendous spectacle in nature, he called it, a phrase that echoes through the history of exploration. For the first time, Antarctica had landmarks, mountains, seas, coasts that could be plotted and named. The myth had gained a body, though its soul remained hidden beneath the ice. Those who returned from the southern voyages spoke of it with reverence and fear. Some claimed that the silence could drive men to madness, that after weeks of staring at the endless white, they began to see shapes moving in the distance, pillars, cities, shadows of movement across the snow. The mirages were likely tricks of light, but the mind has never been content with such simple explanations. The southern world invited wonder precisely because it resisted definition. By mid-century, the world's maps finally had a form where once there had been only legend. The empty circle at the bottom of the globe was filled with tentative lines, not the perfect symmetry of Ptolemy's dream, but a fractured glacial mass of peninsulas and seas. Yet this achievement brought no closure. The more that was known, the deeper the mystery seemed to run. Writers of the Romantic era seized on the imagery of the icebound world. Coleridge, Poe, and later Melville turned Antarctica into metaphor, a mirror of the human spirit confronting the void. In their poems and novels, the white continent became both setting and symbol, the ultimate stage for isolation and revelation. The frozen frontier was no longer just geography, it was philosophy in physical form. Meanwhile, the lure of profit continued. Whalers returned year after year, carving temporary shelters into volcanic islands and scraping a living from the blubber and bones of the southern seas. When they abandoned these outposts, the wind buried them in snow within hours, as though the land itself rejected permanence. The few relics that remain, tools, timber, fragments of clothing, now lie preserved in frost, ghostly traces of those who tried to make the inhospitable endure. As the 19th century advanced, a subtle transformation occurred. The explorers who followed were no longer searching for new trade routes or territory. They sought something less tangible, the satisfaction of reaching the absolute limit. In an age when the Earth's mysteries were shrinking, Antarctica became the last true unknown, the final space where the world could still seem infinite. Every generation needs a frontier. For the Victorians, it lay not among the stars, but beneath the snow. Their ships carried scientific instruments and poetry in equal measure, and each voyage southward was both experiment and pilgrimage. The edge of the map had not vanished. It had simply turned white. By the century's end, one truth was clear. The myth of Terra Australis had not died. It had transformed. The philosopher's continent of balance and symmetry had given way to a harsher revelation. The southern land was real, but it offered no paradise, no wealth, no welcome. It was a reminder that not all mysteries exist to be solved. The world would soon call this new age of discovery heroic, but its beginnings were born in silence, in the moment when the sailors of Ross, Weddell, and D'Urville first realized that the last blank space on the map was not an end, but a beginning. The 19th century had mapped Antarctica's outlines, but not its soul. The coastlines were inked onto charts, the mountains named, and yet the heart of the continent remained untouched, a void at the center of the Earth's last frontier. What the Age of Empire had outlined in cartography, the next generation would attempt to claim in flesh and endurance. The myth was gone, but what replaced it was no less powerful: the pursuit of meaning through hardship. By the late 1800s, the world had changed. Railways crisscrossed continents, telegraph cables linked empires, and the once infinite seas were now predictable corridors of trade. The unknown was disappearing. To men raised in the fever of exploration, that loss was unbearable. If there were no more dragons at the world's edge, then new ones would have to be found, or invented. Antarctica, vast and unmapped beyond its frozen perimeter, became the last place where glory could still be earned the old way, through risk, courage, and the defiance of death. The first to answer that call was Carsten Borchgrevink, a Norwegian of restless ambition. In 1895, he stood before the International Geographical Congress in London and declared that the time had come to plant humanity's feet upon the southern ice. He was met with polite disbelief. Others had seen the Antarctic from the sea, but none had endured its interior. Yet Borchgrevink would not be dismissed. 3 years later, with private funding and a ragged crew, he sailed aboard the Southern Cross and landed on the coast of Victoria Land. There, at Cape Adare, Borchgrevink built a cluster of wooden huts, crude, isolated, lashed together against winds that could tear a man from his feet. The small group of men wintered there, surviving months of darkness and cold that froze their beards to their collars. When they finally emerged in the spring of 1899, they had achieved what no one else had: the first overwintering on the Antarctic mainland. Their experiment proved that humans could endure in that hostile world. The age of possibility had begun. Within a decade, the world's attention shifted decisively south. The heroic age of Antarctic exploration, as it would later be known, unfolded not as a single story, but as a series of rival epics, each man driven by the same need to go farther than the last. National pride mixed with personal obsession, science became the language of glory. The explorers of this era were not conquerors in the imperial sense, but pilgrims chasing a purity that no empire could buy. Foremost among them was the Englishman Robert Falcon Scott, tall, meticulous, and drawn to the South Pole as if by fate. In 1901, Scott commanded the Discovery Expedition, the first large-scale scientific mission to Antarctica. His ships carried naturalists, geologists, meteorologists, and young officers who would one day become legends themselves. Among them was a fiery, restless Irishman named Ernest Shackleton. The men endured 2 years trapped in the Ross Sea, their ship locked in ice. They measured winds, collected fossils, and mapped glaciers, but the cold gnawed at their lungs, and the endless night tested their minds. When they returned to England in 1904, they were heroes. Yet for Scott and Shackleton, survival was not enough. They had seen the mountains that led inward, and the horizon beyond them called louder than the applause of civilization. Shackleton returned first. In 1907, commanding the Nimrod, he led a small party across the Ross ice shelf toward the pole itself. For months, they marched through blizzards, hauling sledges by hand, crossing terrain no one had ever seen. Their bodies wasted away, their supplies dwindled. On January 9th, 1909, they reached within 97 miles of the South Pole before turning back to save their lives. Shackleton wrote in his diary that turning away was harder than death. When he returned home, he was hailed as a hero nonetheless. The man who turned back. His failure was victory enough. 2 years later, another nation answered. The Norwegian Roald Amundsen, silent and calculating, had secretly shifted his plans from the Arctic to the Antarctic. His goal was simple: to reach the South Pole first. In the southern summer of 1911, while Scott prepared his own second expedition, Amundsen's team of 5 men and 52 sled dogs set out across the ice from the Bay of Whales. They moved swiftly and efficiently, guided by experience and precision. On December 14th, 1911, Amundsen planted the Norwegian flag at the geographic South Pole, the first human to stand at Earth's bottom. A month later, Scott's party reached the same point. What they found was the small black tent Amundsen had left behind, the flag still fluttering in the thin air. Scott's men stood in silence. They had marched for months through frost and hunger, only to discover they had been beaten. The journey back would destroy them. One by one, they fell. Evans, Oates, Wilson, Bowers, and finally Scott himself, found frozen in his tent beside his journal. His final entry read, "For God's sake, look after our people." Their deaths transformed defeat into legend. The British mourned them as martyrs of courage and honor. Their frozen faces became the icons of endurance. In that moment, the heroic age earned its name. Shackleton returned once more to the ice in 1914, commanding the Endurance. His mission was to cross the entire continent, an ambition that would eclipse all others. Instead, it became one of history's greatest survival stories. The Endurance was trapped and crushed in the pack ice of the Weddell Sea. Shackleton and his crew drifted on floes for months before escaping in small boats to the desolate island of South Georgia. Against impossible odds, every man survived. Shackleton's leadership, calm and absolute, made him a legend, not for reaching the pole, but for saving his crew from it. Each expedition added new lines to the map, new data to the ledgers of science. The Transantarctic Mountains, the Ross Ice Shelf, and the volcanic spire of Mount Erebus became more than names. They were coordinates of human will. The explorers brought back fossils of ancient forests, confirming that the frozen desert had once been green. They measured magnetism, charted glaciers, and captured photographs that turned endurance into art. But their achievements were not only geographic. In those years between 1895 and 1922, Antarctica became a mirror of humanity itself, a place where ambition met its own reflection in the ice. The explorers were driven not by conquest, but by confrontation. Man against nature, man against himself. The South Pole was not the reward. The journey was. When Shackleton died in 1922, on his final voyage back to South Georgia, it felt as though the era he defined died with him. The heroic age had closed. Airplanes, engines, and radio would soon replace dogs and sledges. The silence that once demanded courage would yield to the hum of machines. But for a few short decades, Antarctica had been more than a landscape. It was a crucible where the human spirit tested its limits and found them sacred. In that frozen theater of endurance, myth was reborn in the shape of men. The age of gods and maps had ended, yet the white continent remained, watching, as if waiting for the next story to begin. The heroic age had given Antarctica a human voice. The sound of sledges scraping over ice, of dogs barking into the wind, of breath crystallizing in the air. By the early 20th century, the continent had become both a destination and a mirror. To reach its heart was to look inward, to measure not distance, but resolve. The explorers of this final phase knew that their journeys would be long remembered, but none yet understood that they were writing the closing chapter of an age. After Shackleton's miraculous return from the Endurance expedition, Antarctica seemed to fall silent for a moment. The world, however, did not. In Europe, war thundered through cities and across empires, swallowing the spirit of adventure in its mechanical hunger. The men who once charted glaciers now commanded trenches. Shackleton himself tried to serve, training soldiers for survival in extreme conditions, but the ice still called to him. In 1921, with peace restored and the old world reshaped, he organized one final journey, the Shackleton Rowett expedition aboard the Quest. Its purpose was vague, part exploration, part personal pilgrimage. For Shackleton, it was a return to the one place that had never betrayed him. But age and exhaustion had followed him south. When the Quest anchored at South Georgia Island, the familiar winds rose from the mountains like an echo of the past. Shackleton wrote in his log, "In the darkening twilight, I saw South Georgia appear, a lonely island shrouded in storm. That night, he suffered a heart attack in his cabin and died before dawn. His crew buried him there, beneath the cold soil of Grytviken, facing the sea he had conquered and the continent he never reached. His death closed the heroic age. The Antarctic, once a stage for glory, would soon become a laboratory for nations. But for those who came after, Shackleton's grave marked more than an ending. It was a boundary between myth and modernity. The world he left behind was changing faster than any explorer could have imagined. Steamships grew into icebreakers, canvas sails into propellers, and the long isolation of polar travel gave way to the mechanical rhythm of engines. Yet the spirit of the heroic age lingered, haunting every expedition that followed. When others spoke of logistics, Shackleton had spoken of destiny. After 1922, exploration continued under new banners. The British still dreamed of scientific supremacy, the Norwegians of navigation, the Australians of territorial claim. But the language had shifted. No longer was Antarctica described as the white hell or the end of the earth. It was now a natural laboratory, a field of study, a zone of potential. The transformation from legend to science had begun, but it was not complete. The ghosts of the heroic age were not easily dismissed. One man who understood that transition was Richard Evelyn Byrd, a decorated American aviator who saw in Antarctica both challenge and stage. In 1928, he launched the first major expedition of the modern era, not by sea alone, but by air. Where Scott and Amundsen had marched across ice, Byrd flew above it. From the frozen base he built on the Ross ice shelf, he conducted aerial surveys that mapped more land in months than all the previous expeditions combined had charted in years. Byrd's achievements carried a different kind of courage. He pioneered the use of airplanes, radios, and tractors, turning exploration into an organized feat of technology. In 1929, he became the first man to fly over the South Pole, a flight that lasted nearly 19 hours and returned him safely to base. The world celebrated him as the new hero of the South, though he himself always spoke of those who had come before. "We are," he said, "children of their endurance." The contrast between Byrd and the old explorers was striking. Scott and Shackleton had faced the pole with their own bodies as instruments. Byrd faced it with machines. Yet both eras shared the same reverence, the understanding that Antarctica was more than geography. In every generation, the ice demanded something different, but never less than everything a person could give. Even with technology, the land did not surrender easily. Byrd's expeditions faced storms that could crush aircraft wings like paper, temperatures that froze oil in engines, and blizzards that erased entire camps overnight. Men still risked death at every turn. The tools had changed, but the essence of exploration, courage against indifference, remained. As the decades turned, the continent that had once been a stage for rivalry became a crucible for cooperation. The heroic age had been a contest of nations and egos. The era that followed sought to understand rather than conquer. Science replaced flag planting, yet every scientist who set foot on the ice still carried a trace of the old hunger. They measured, mapped, and drilled. But deep down they felt the same awe that had driven Scott toward the horizon and Shackleton back to save his men. From this inheritance grew the new mythology of Antarctica, one not of heroes and martyrs, but of endurance and meaning. Each discovery added another dimension to the continent's character. Volcanic mountains hidden beneath glaciers, fossil forests embedded in stone, meteorites from beyond the solar system glinting on the snow. In the emptiness where the first explorers had sought glory, science found history written in ice. Still, something of the heroic age endures in every gust that sweeps across the Ross Sea, every shadow that stretches over Shackleton's grave. The men who marched toward the pole left no empires behind, no riches to be mined, or cities to bear their names. What they built instead was a mythology of endurance, a reminder that the boundaries of the world are not lines on a map, but the limits of will and wonder. When Shackleton's body was lowered into the ground, a storm rolled over South Georgia, and the crew of the Quest watched the snow swallow their footprints as fast as they made them. The wind buried the sound of their shovels. The sea rose and fell like slow breathing. It was as if the continent itself was reclaiming its own. The age of heroes had ended, but the ice remained eternal, indifferent and vast, the keeper of their stories, the silent continuation of their dream. As the echoes of the heroic age faded into history, Antarctica seemed finally conquered by science, mapped, measured, and subdued. But the ice was not finished with mystery. Beneath its glacial calm, the continent began to gather new legends, not born of exploration, but of secrecy. The early decades of the 20th century saw the white world transformed from a stage of courage into a theatre of rumour. The heroic age had left behind questions, and the modern one inherited them like buried ghosts. After the death of Shackleton, expeditions continued, but their purpose shifted. The world had changed. The age of empire had collapsed, and war had redrawn the boundaries of belief. Science marched forward, hand in hand with politics. To the governments of the 1930s, Antarctica was no longer simply a frontier of curiosity. It was territory, resource, and potential. Beneath the guise of research, nations began to send ships not for wonder, but for reconnaissance. In 1938, Germany launched the Third Reich's Antarctic expedition. Officially, its mission was benign: to scout for whaling zones and survey terrain that might aid the country's self-sufficiency. The ship, MS Schwabenland, sailed south from Hamburg, carrying aircraft equipped to photograph vast stretches of the Queen Maud Land region. Over the course of several weeks, German pilots flew hundreds of reconnaissance flights, dropping metal darts marked with swastikas to stake symbolic claim. The land they mapped, they named Neuschwabenland, New Swabia. The data they gathered was valuable and largely scientific: weather records, aerial photographs, notes on sea ice and topography. Yet when war engulfed Europe only months later, the mission vanished into obscurity. Its maps disappeared into archives, and its intentions, once routine, were soon reimagined in whispers. In the post-war years, Neuschwabenland would become a ghost region in the world's imagination, the blank where history met speculation. The power of myth is not that it invents, but that it fills silence. After 1945, silence was all that surrounded the South. Whispers spread that the Germans had discovered something extraordinary beneath the ice, that they had built secret bases, even cities, hidden within mountain caverns warmed by geothermal heat. No evidence supported such claims, but the idea endured, nourished by the public's growing fascination with what could not be seen. In the dark uncertainty of the Cold War, Antarctica became a stage on which every nation projected its fears. It was into this atmosphere that the most ambitious polar operation in history was launched. In 1946, less than a year after the Second World War ended, the United States Navy sent Operation High Jump, a fleet of 13 ships, 23 aircraft, and nearly 5,000 personnel, to Antarctica under the command of Admiral Richard Evelyn Byrd. Officially, it was an exercise in logistics, testing men and machines under extreme conditions, training for cold weather warfare, and expanding the US presence in polar regions. Yet the scale of the mission was so vast that it invited speculation before it even reached the ice. For months, the operation's ships plowed through the Southern Ocean, their wake cutting into the same waters once haunted by Ross and Shackleton. Aircraft surveyed coastlines and mountains, documenting over 1 million square miles of terrain. The Navy reported mechanical failures, severe weather, and the loss of several planes. Tragedies, but not mysteries. Nevertheless, when the expedition abruptly ended weeks earlier than planned, rumors began to spiral. Why had so massive a fleet turned back so soon? Admiral Byrd, exhausted and weather-worn, returned to the United States and, during a brief stop in Chile, gave a cryptic interview to a local newspaper. He warned that the United States should prepare for the possibility of hostile aircraft coming from the polar regions. The statement, meant as a general reflection on air defense, was quickly stripped of context and given a darker reading. In the fevered imagination of the post-war world, Byrd's words became evidence of something unspeakable, an encounter with forces unknown beneath the ice. By the 1950s, the story had grown into legend. Whispers of flying discs seen over the ice, merged with tales of subterranean realms and hidden civilizations. Some said that Byrd had discovered an entrance to the hollow earth, where advanced beings warned him against humanity's destructive path. Others believed that remnants of the defeated Reich had fled south, creating a secret base powered by technology not of this world. Each new version contradicted the last, but all shared one trait. They replaced absence with awe. The world was ready to believe. In the shadow of atomic fear and Cold War paranoia, Antarctica became the perfect stage for secrecy. It was remote, silent, and inaccessible, an ideal hiding place for whatever truth might exist beyond comprehension. Governments spoke little of their operations there, and that silence was enough. When people cannot see what happens, they imagine it. Yet amid these whispers, genuine discoveries continued. In the same years that conspiracy flourished, radar and aerial photography began to reveal Antarctica's hidden structure. Vast subglacial mountains, valleys buried under kilometers of ice, and liquid lakes sealed from the surface for millions of years. The truth, though purely geological, seemed to echo myth itself, an unseen world beneath the frozen crust. The facts and the fantasies began to overlap until even scientists struggled to separate them in the public mind. By 1957, as the International Geophysical Year approached, cooperation replaced competition, and a new vision of Antarctica emerged. Dozens of nations joined in shared scientific effort, building permanent stations and networks of research that would span the continent. Operation Deep Freeze, organized by the United States Navy, laid the foundations for the era of modern exploration. McMurdo Station, Amundsen Scott Base, and others that remain to this day. Yet even then, secrecy lingered. The same aircraft that carried scientists also carried military equipment. The same radar that mapped mountains also monitored radio signals. The distinction between exploration and surveillance blurred in the snow. To those watching from afar, the white continent seemed once again to guard a secret. Only now, the mystery was hidden behind bureaucratic language and classified reports. And so, Antarctica entered a new kind of legend. Where once it had been a proving ground for courage, it became a mirror for suspicion. Some saw in its isolation a refuge for the remnants of ancient powers. Others imagined that alien eyes watched from beneath its storms. The continent, always silent, never confirmed nor denied a single rumor. If there is one truth that connects all ages of exploration, it is this: the less we know, the more we imagine. In that sense, the myths of Neuschwabenland and Operation High Jump belong to the same lineage as the dreams of Terra Australis and Atlantis. Each is born from the same desire, to find meaning at the edge of the known world. With the age of heroes gone, Antarctica had found new ones: scientists, soldiers, and storytellers. Their tools were radar and rumor, their discoveries half measured and half believed. The ice had changed, but its hold on the human mind remained absolute. The world that emerged from the Second World War was smaller and sharper, divided by ideologies that stretched from orbit to the ocean floor. Antarctica, once distant from history, suddenly found itself at its crossroads. In the minds of politicians and the imaginations of the public, it became both sanctuary and secret, a blank page upon which the new age of suspicion could be written. The late 1940s were years of contradiction. Science advanced faster than ever, yet fear grew just as quickly. The atomic age had arrived, and with it came the awareness that humanity's greatest triumphs could also be its undoing. Antarctica, pure and untouched, appeared to offer refuge from that shadow. But its silence invited other interpretations. Where ordinary eyes saw only ice and wind, others saw what might be hidden beneath them. Operation High Jump had left behind more questions than data. Admiral Byrd's massive expedition was followed by smaller missions, each framed in the calm language of research. Yet the world whispered about something else. Theories multiplied. Tales of inner worlds, secret tunnels, ancient artifacts, and technologies beyond understanding. In magazines and radio programs, these ideas fused with another emerging phenomenon, the dawn of the UFO era. In the early 1950s, reports of strange lights over the Arctic and Antarctic skies became frequent. Pilots spoke of luminous disks hovering over ice fields, of objects darting through clouds at impossible speeds. Most sightings were easily explained. Reflections on instruments, atmospheric optics, or even the aurora, but explanation rarely satisfies imagination. Soon, Antarctica's long nights were crowded not just with stars, but with speculation. The continent's reputation as a realm of secrecy deepened as the Cold War hardened. Both the United States and the Soviet Union sought dominance not only on land and sea, but across the poles. Submarines prowled the southern waters. Spy planes traced the edges of the Antarctic Circle. Officially, every mission served peaceful ends, but the line between science and strategy grew faint. The ice had no borders, but its skies did. During this time, stories of Nazi survival in Antarctica flourished. They were absurd, yet persistent, a modern evolution of medieval myth. Some claimed that remnants of the Third Reich had fled to underground fortresses in Queen Maud Land, that secret submarines carried advanced technology to the southern hemisphere before the war's end. According to the stories, these fugitives allied with non-human intelligences and continued their experiments beneath the ice. No evidence ever surfaced, yet the legend endured, sustained by the same paradox that had always defined Antarctica: absence of proof mistaken for proof of absence. In this atmosphere of unease, every unexplained phenomenon found a home on the southern continent. Crashed craft, hidden civilizations, lost libraries, all were said to lie beneath the glaciers. When the Antarctic Treaty was signed in 1959, declaring the continent a demilitarized zone dedicated to science, conspiracy theorists saw not progress, but concealment. Why, they asked, had rival nations suddenly agreed to protect a frozen wasteland? What secret required such unity? The answer was simple and extraordinary: science itself. The treaty was the product of the International Geophysical Year, 1957-1958, when 12 nations had come together to study the Earth as a single system. They established permanent research bases, shared meteorological data, and drilled the first deep ice cores. It was one of humanity's rare collective efforts to understand rather than divide. But for those who saw plots in every silence, the cooperation only deepened the mystery. In that same year, Operation Deep Freeze began under the United States Navy, the logistical backbone of Antarctic research. It ferried equipment, fuel, and people across the frozen seas, establishing stations that still operate today. McMurdo, Amundsen, Scott, Bird, and others. The operation's scale was immense, its coordination precise, its military support undeniable. And though its goals were scientific, its nature, fleets, aircraft, command structures, made secrecy inevitable. Where secrecy exists, stories bloom. Rumors soon followed of tunnels beneath the ice, of radar echoes hinting at hollow caverns or vast metallic shapes buried in the way permafrost. Aerial photographs showing geometric shadows were said to reveal hidden bases. Even natural features, like the yawning mouths of glaciers or volcanic calderas, were recast as entrances to something subterranean. The public's appetite for hidden truth outpaced the slow work of scientists. This new mythology of the South mirrored the paranoia of its age. The same fears that once haunted the skies above Roswell now drifted over the Ross Sea. In both, the unknown became a reflection of what humanity could not face about itself. Its secrecy, its power, its destructive potential. Antarctica's remoteness made it the perfect canvas. A land that belonged to no one could belong to every mystery. Meanwhile, genuine discoveries lent credibility to speculation. Radar mapping revealed entire mountain ranges beneath the ice. The Gamburtsev subglacial mountains, a hidden chain as vast as the Alps, entombed for millions of years. Beneath the East Antarctic ice sheet, scientists detected anomalies in gravity and magnetism, suggesting structures or densities they could not yet explain. Each revelation, though grounded in physics, sounded like myth reborn. In newspapers and scientific journals alike, the language of wonder returned. Headlines spoke of a buried world beneath the ice and ancient landscapes frozen in time. It was as though the imagination of earlier centuries had found new life through technology. Even as sonar replaced parchment and radar replaced rumor, the sense of awe remained the same. The deeper science reached, the closer it came to the myth it had replaced. Beneath the cold precision of instruments lingered the same question that haunted every explorer, from Magellan to Shackleton: what lies beyond what we can see? By the close of the 1950s, Antarctica stood transformed, no longer the untouched kingdom of explorers, but a paradox of transparency and secrecy. It was open to all and understood by none, governed by treaties and theories, guarded by the very nations that had once sought to claim it. The white frontier had become the mirror of the modern mind, brilliant, cold, divided between knowledge and suspicion. Even now, in every generation, the myths of that decade survive. They drift across the internet as once they drifted across tavern tables and radio waves. Tales of lost German colonies, alien relics, entrances to hollow worlds, and buried technologies waiting to awaken. None have ever been proven, yet none have truly died. Perhaps they persist because Antarctica itself encourages them. The continent's silence invites imagination, and its vastness swallows certainty. It is a place that reveals just enough truth to keep the mystery alive. As the Cold War deepened and humanity turned its gaze to the stars, Antarctica remained below, a second cosmos beneath our feet, a frozen mirror of the unknown. In 1957, while much of the world was split between nuclear fear and technological ambition, a quieter revolution began at the bottom of the Earth. The International Geophysical Year, known as IGY, brought together 67 nations in an unprecedented act of scientific unity. The goal was not conquest or competition, but understanding, to study the planet as a single living system. The stage for that cooperation was Antarctica, a land so inhospitable that its very hostility made it pure. Here, the planet could be studied without politics, or so the world hoped. The IGY changed everything. Dozens of expeditions converged on the White Continent. Russians built Vostok Station on the Polar Plateau. Americans established McMurdo Base on the Ross Sea. And smaller nations, New Zealand, France, Japan, Norway, carved out footholds of their own. Airstrips were leveled on ice. Radio towers rose from the snow, and fuel lines snaked across frozen plains where no life had walked before. The hum of engines replaced the silence of centuries. In that single year, scientists accomplished what the heroic age never could. They drilled into glaciers, measured seismic tremors, recorded magnetic fields, and launched weather balloons into the stratosphere. What they found beneath the ice startled even the most pragmatic minds. The world had imagined Antarctica as a lifeless shell. In reality, it was an archive, a frozen library of time. Every layer of snow that fell over the past 800,000 years remained sealed in the ice, each stratum a page of the planet's autobiography. Within those translucent layers were tiny bubbles of ancient air, perfect snapshots of Earth's past atmosphere. For the first time, humanity could read the history of its own climate, written not in myth, but in oxygen and carbon. When the ice cores were brought to laboratories, scientists discovered patterns that echoed across millennia. Long cycles of warming and cooling, extinction and renewal. The data revealed that climate was not a fixed state, but a pulse, that the Earth itself breathed, and we were living in one of its brief, warm exhalations. What had once been mythic balance, the philosophy of Terra Australis, now found its proof in chemistry. But beneath those triumphs lingered deeper enigmas. The same year the IGY ended, seismologists detected echoes in the crust that suggested something unimaginable. A liquid lake sealed under 4 kilometers of ice. It would later be named Lake Vostok after the nearby Russian station. Its existence challenged every assumption about the planet's frozen heart. How could liquid water survive in such cold? What forces kept it from freezing solid? As scientists debated, the theories grew as strange as the landscape itself. Some proposed that geothermal heat from the Earth's mantle seeped upward through fissures. Others suggested pressure from the massive overlying ice kept the water from crystallizing. Whatever the cause, the discovery hinted at something profound. The possibility of life in absolute isolation. If microorganisms had survived beneath the ice for millions of years, then Antarctica was not merely a window into Earth's past. It was a mirror of alien worlds. The same conditions that prevailed in Lake Vostok might exist under the frozen crust of Jupiter's moon Europa or Saturn's Enceladus. By drilling into the ice, humanity might not only explore its own history, but glimpse its future, or its reflection in the stars. Still, the discovery raised uncomfortable questions. To reach Lake Vostok, scientists would need to pierce a world that had been sealed longer than civilization itself. What if contamination occurred? What if something ancient, bacterial, chemical, or otherwise, were released? The debate became an ethical reckoning. Even in the pursuit of knowledge, Antarctica demanded humility. While science advanced, the shadow of secrecy never lifted. The continent's new outposts were often funded or supplied by military organizations. The Cold War turned even ice into a potential battlefield of information. Radar installations doubled as research stations. Reconnaissance flights masked as mapping missions. Every nation claimed to study climate or magnetism, yet every base carried antennae tall enough to eavesdrop on the sky. Among researchers, cooperation thrived. Among governments, suspicion persisted. The Antarctic Treaty of 1959 tried to end that ambiguity. Signed by 12 nations, it declared the entire continent a sanctuary for peace and science. No military activity, no nuclear testing, no territorial claims, only research. It was a miracle of diplomacy at the height of the Cold War, a rare moment when humanity agreed that some parts of the world should remain beyond conquest. But even that act of unity deepened the mystery. In a century defined by rivalry, why did the superpowers suddenly cooperate over a land of ice and stone? Conspiracy theorists found their answer in the silence between lines of the treaty. Some insisted that the nations had discovered something under the ice so extraordinary that secrecy became necessity, a shared secret too large for any one power to own. Science, however, continued to reveal wonders enough without fiction. Satellite imaging in the 1970s confirmed that Antarctica was not a monolith, but a patchwork of ancient terrains stitched together like continents in miniature. Beneath the ice, mountains as tall as the Alps and valleys deeper than the Grand Canyon sprawled unseen. One of the most astonishing finds was the Gamburtsev subglacial range, an entire mountain chain entombed beneath East Antarctica's ice sheet. How such peaks could exist in complete darkness, untouched by erosion, puzzled geologists. It was as if a piece of prehistory had been cryogenically preserved. Then came a stranger discovery still. In 2006, gravity mapping satellites detected an enormous mass anomaly beneath Wilkes Land, stretching hundreds of kilometers across. The data suggested a dense structure buried deep below, perhaps the remnant of an ancient asteroid impact, or perhaps something even older, locked in the planet's crust. To scientists, it was a geological riddle. To others, it was an invitation for imagination. The resemblance between those findings and the old myths of something buried beneath the ice did not go unnoticed. Pseudoscientists claimed it was the lost city of Atlantis. Others said it was an alien craft the size of a mountain. In reality, the anomaly was a product of planetary history, not extraterrestrial design. Yet even the most rational explanations carried an aura of awe. The ice, it seemed, refused to let go of its mythic aura, no matter how precise the instruments aimed at it became. Meanwhile, meteorites found resting on the ice added another chapter to the continent's cosmic mystery. Antarctica's vast white plain acts as a natural trap for space debris, preserving rocks that have traveled across the solar system. Among them was a Martian meteorite discovered in 1984, whose microscopic structures once sparked debate over the existence of alien life. Though the claim was later refuted, the notion that Antarctica could hold proof of life beyond Earth captured imaginations everywhere. Each discovery drew humanity closer to the truth and, paradoxically, back toward wonder. The continent had become the purest expression of contradiction, a place where the rigor of science met the persistence of mystery. The instruments improved, the questions remained. Even today, drilling projects across Antarctica retrieve new layers of ancient ice, each revealing the planet's hidden rhythms. The data they hold stretches back hundreds of millennia, chronicling volcanic winters, sudden thaws, and the slow dance of extinction and rebirth. Beneath those records, radar reveals liquid rivers moving through the darkness, entire networks of flowing water beneath the frozen desert. In the heart of that darkness, where the light of the sun never reaches, the pulse of the planet still beats. It is faint but steady, echoing through the ice that has seen continents drift, species vanish, and civilizations rise and fall. And somewhere within that frozen memory, beneath the weight of millions of years, the last remnants of the ancient green world still wait, locked in their crystal tomb, whispering through layers of ice, reminding us that even in a world of pure science, the unknown endures. By the late 20th century, Antarctica had become a paradox, both the most studied and the least known place on Earth. Satellites mapped every ripple of its surface, radar pierced its depths, and yet the more that was revealed, the greater the sense of awe grew. The discoveries of the scientific age did not erase the mystery, they refined it. Beneath the endless white stretched a world that was alive in ways few could have imagined. It began with the subglacial lakes. What had started as faint signals on seismographs during the International Geophysical Year had by the 1990s turned into confirmed realities. Hundreds of liquid bodies sealed away under the ice, hidden beneath kilometers of pressure and darkness. They defied the logic of cold. Some were as large as inland seas, connected by invisible rivers that wound through the black. Others were smaller, trapped in ancient valleys, filled and drained in slow rhythms like lungs drawing breath. Scientists approached them cautiously. To reach one was to risk contaminating an ecosystem that had been isolated for millions of years. When at last an international team drilled into one of the great buried lakes, what rose from the depths astonished even the most reserved minds. The water, black and heavy with minerals, shimmered faintly under artificial light. In that liquid darkness lived microscopic forms, organisms that had never seen sunlight, feeding not on plants or oxygen, but on iron, sulfur, and stone. They were proof that life could exist in conditions beyond imagination, not merely survive, but thrive. In that revelation, Earth and the cosmos briefly touched. If creatures could endure in Antarctica's eternal night, perhaps similar life might stir beneath the frozen crust of distant moons, or deep under the ice caps of Mars. Antarctica had become not only a window into the past, but a rehearsal for discovery beyond the planet itself. The surprises did not stop there. Remote drilling in the Ross ice shelf revealed sediments filled with ancient pollen, remnants of trees that once grew along the coast. Even deeper cores brought up the ghostly imprints of leaves, delicate veins and fronds pressed flat by time. In the distant Eocene, before the ice took dominion, Antarctica had been a land of rainforests and slow rivers, a continent rich in green. To hold those fossils in one's hand was to feel the weight of Earth's memory. And then there were the hidden mountains, entire ranges buried beneath the ice, preserved in perfect silhouette. Among them, a chain of peaks rose from the bedrock, like the backbone of a forgotten world, unseen for tens of millions of years. To the instruments that detected them, they appeared as faint echoes, shapes of shadow within shadow. When the data was translated into maps, what emerged resembled the ghost of another continent buried within this one. It seemed that Antarctica did not simply hide history. It contained worlds layered within itself, each frozen in a different era. As the scientific age unfolded, instruments became more precise and the questions more philosophical. Why did this land, of all places, hold so many contradictions? Fire beneath frost, motion within stillness, life in the absence of light. The answer, scientists said, was in the balance between the planet's heart and its heavens, the warmth that rose from the mantle below and the cold that descended from space above. Between the two, Antarctica became a realm of eternal tension, a frozen equilibrium where extremes met and sustained each other. In this strange equilibrium, the ice itself lives. It flows, it fractures, it heals. It creaks and groans as it moves, migrating toward the sea at a pace too slow for human eyes, but relentless across the centuries. Beneath it, rivers of meltwater flow in silence, carving unseen valleys. The continent breathes through avalanches and storms, Its glaciers carve with the thunder of continents shifting in miniature. Each sound is a heartbeat of stone and snow. Even the air above it bears secrets. Scientists studying ice cores found that the bubbles trapped within are not merely fossils of air, but records of the planet's long dialogue with the sky. Within those tiny spheres lie traces of volcanic smoke, ancient fires, and the breath of forests that died long before the first human word was spoken. Each analysis rewrote history in molecules, yet for all its precision, science could not diminish the land's strangeness. Every discovery seemed to open another question. The deeper humanity looked, the more the continent resembled a mirror of ourselves, ancient, secretive, layered in memory. In the 21st century, satellites captured images of geometric shadows on the ice, angles too precise for nature, yet explained by geology and erosion. Natural formations, scientists said. But the images spread, feeding once again the mythic imagination that never quite died. The same old voices returned, claiming that ancient structures still stood beneath the glaciers, that the ice covered more than rivers and stone. And while scholars dismissed those tales, they could not silence the public fascination. Perhaps it was because the truth, in its own way, was equally astonishing. That beneath the ice, the planet itself still moved, still breathed, still harbored mysteries beyond human scale. The most haunting of all discoveries came not from instruments, but from a phenomenon visible even to the naked eye. In the McMurdo dry valleys, where the land is bare and the glaciers hang like glass over stone, a crimson river spills from the mouth of a frozen cliff. It stains the white ice in streaks of blood red. Blood falls, as explorers named it. The color is not life, but chemistry. Salt water rich in iron, forced upward from a buried lake by pressure and freezing air. Yet beneath that rust-colored flow, microbial life persists, feeding on the minerals and darkness. Even here, in what seems pure death, the earth refuses to be lifeless. The image of that red waterfall flowing from the white glacier has become a symbol of Antarctica itself, a place where opposites coexist, where the cold conceals fire and the stillness hides motion. It reminds us that the continent's true mystery is not in legends of alien craft or hollow worlds, but in the revelation that life endures even where it should not. Every age has tried to define Antarctica as Eden, as tomb, as laboratory, as gateway. None of those names fit completely. It remains all of them at once. In its silence, humanity sees both its origin and its future, a reminder that knowledge and wonder are not enemies, but companions. Even as satellites scan every ridge and drones trace every crevasse, a question remains as old as the maps that once marked here be monsters. If the ice can live, what else might it remember? At the bottom of the world lies a silence so deep it feels eternal. Antarctica, the last frontier, the final blank on the map, has outlived empires, explorers, and mythologies alike. It has swallowed the dreams of conquest and replaced them with a humbling truth, that the Earth's last secret is not treasure or power, but time itself. Here, the wind writes its own scripture. It carves the snow into endless ridges, sings through the poles of weather stations, and buries footprints within minutes. Above it all, the sky burns with a cold blue so pure, it seems to belong to another planet. No other place on Earth feels so alien, and yet none mirrors us more completely. For those who live and work here now, the scientists, engineers, and caretakers of the modern age, life is measured not in days, but in light. The sun rises once a year and sets once a year, turning the sky into a slow pendulum between radiance and night. In summer, the sun circles the horizon endlessly, painting the ice in gold at midnight. In winter, darkness falls like a curtain that will not lift for months. During those long months of night, human presence shrinks to a few scattered outposts: McMurdo, Amundsen Scott, Vostok, Concordia, each a fragile spark of warmth in the abyss. Inside their steel walls, machines hum softly, monitoring the weather, the stars, the shifting of ice. Beyond the walls lies the kind of quiet that can make a person hear their own heartbeat too loudly. Isolation here is not metaphorical, it is absolute. When the last flight leaves at the end of summer, the continent closes. Temperatures plunge below -80 degrees Celsius. No aircraft can land safely. No ship can reach the coast through frozen seas. For 8 months, the people of the ice are alone. Tiny, luminous cells in a white organism vast beyond comprehension. And yet, within that solitude, something remarkable happens. People speak of how their sense of time changes, how their perception of distance and meaning begins to blur. The mind, stripped of noise, turns inward. In the stillness of the Antarctic night, some say they feel the planet itself breathing, a slow, immense rhythm beneath their feet. To scientists, this is the pulse of the Earth. The ice shifts, the glaciers advance and retreat. The planet exhales through storms and creeks. To others, it is something more metaphysical. The presence of the past pressing upward from below. The consciousness of a world that remembers. Modern Antarctica is no longer a place of heroic voyages or mythic speculation, yet both linger beneath its surface. Each research station stands like a monument to endurance, the descendant of every expedition that came before. Inside them, human curiosity continues its slow excavation of the unknown. At the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station, researchers study the faint cosmic background radiation, the oldest light in the universe, that filters down through the thin, clear air. They sit at the coldest point on Earth and look back nearly 14 billion years in time. The instruments they use are unimaginably sensitive, detecting whispers from the dawn of creation. It is fitting that the farthest place from civilization has become the best vantage point for observing eternity. Elsewhere, at Concordia Station on the high polar plateau, scientists study not stars, but themselves. In isolation so complete it rivals spaceflight, they monitor the human mind, how it adapts, how it dreams. The European Space Agency calls Concordia White Mars, a test ground for the psychology of cosmic exile. For those who stay there through the long winter, sleep becomes a fragile thing, and memory feels porous, as though the ice itself is seeping in. Everywhere, the frontier has shifted from exploration to introspection. Antarctica has become a mirror for the species that once sought to conquer it. It no longer measures courage in miles marched or flags planted, but in patience, in the willingness to dwell in silence and listen to what the world has been trying to say since the beginning. And still, the silence is never empty. Beneath the ice, life persists, indifferent to our wonder. Tiny organisms float in subglacial lakes, feeding on minerals drawn from rock. Cold-loving algae bloom in cracks where sunlight filters faintly through, turning snow pink or green for a few fleeting weeks. Seals haul themselves onto the ice, their bodies shaped by millennia of adaptation. Penguins march through blizzards that would freeze steel, carrying the warmth of the living in the heart of the dead continent. Each of these creatures is a small defiance, a reminder that life's truest frontier is not space or depth, but endurance. Even here, where the temperature can halt blood and the air itself seems brittle, the Earth refuses extinction. To stand on this continent, even briefly, is to feel that defiance in one's bones. The wind cuts not just skin, but thought. It strips away the idea of human centrality. You realize, as the early explorers did, that the ice does not care. It will outlast every nation, every map, every monument. It will remember all and forgive nothing. The Antarctic Treaty, signed in 1959, still protects this vast silence. It forbids war, mining, and exploitation, reserving the continent for peace and research. It is humanity's one successful experiment in restraint, proof that we can, at least once, choose preservation over possession. Even so, the treaty is fragile. Climate change gnaws at its borders. Global ambition tests its patience. As the planet warms, the ice responds, melting at the edges like paper touched by flame. The balance that has lasted for millions of years begins to tremble. From satellites, scientists watch glaciers carve into the sea, colossal walls of ice breaking apart and collapsing in thunderous slow motion. The sound echoes across oceans, a deep and distant note in the symphony of change. Some call it natural, others a warning. What is certain is that Antarctica, once a symbol of permanence, has begun to move again, and the world will follow its rhythm whether it wishes to or not. As temperatures rise, fragments of that buried green world beneath the ice begin to surface. Ancient soil, frozen since before humans walked the earth, now feels the sun for the first time in eons. Fossilized wood, pollen, and fragments of long-extinct mosses appear like artifacts from another earth. The ice, as it melts, is not only vanishing, it is revealing, and with revelation comes unease. What else might be hidden below, waiting for thaw? Rivers, once frozen, begin to flow again, carrying sediments and secrets. Lakes long sealed begin to stir. Microbes from ages unknown awaken. It is easy to see why myth persists, why some still whisper about ruins beneath the ice, about what might lie waiting. The difference now is that we no longer need to imagine a sleeping civilization. The truth itself is enough. The planet is thawing its own memory. For all our technology, we remain voyeurs before the scale of that process. Satellites record, sensors measure, but comprehension lags behind. In the face of such vastness, even data becomes poetic. When scientists describe the ice flowing like glass, they are naming a paradox. Something solid that moves, something alive that looks dead. To those who work there, Antarctica becomes less a place than a state of mind. Months of isolation reduce existence to essentials: warmth, light, breath, heartbeat. Beyond that, everything else feels superfluous. It is as if the continent itself teaches humility, stripping humanity back to the elements that created it. Many who leave the ice say it never truly leaves them. Its silence follows like a presence just behind the shoulder. That silence is what defines Antarctica. Not emptiness, but vast containment. The wind erases the human voice, yet carries the sound of the planet's own speech. To listen is to realize that the earth is not mute. We have simply been too loud to hear it. The frozen continent also speaks in symbols. To some, it represents endurance. To others, restraint. It is a place that resists ownership, defies simplification, and humbles ambition. Every generation rediscovers it in its own image. Explorers saw glory, scientists saw data, and now we see warning. But the ice itself remains unchanged in purpose. It endures, holding within it the archive of everything that has ever been. In recent years, environmental scientists have called Antarctica the planet's thermostat, the regulator of oceans, weather, and climate. When its balance shifts, the world follows. Each iceberg that drifts north carries more than frozen water. It carries history, layered and compacted, melting into the same seas that cradle our coasts. In this way, the fate of the frozen continent is inseparable from our own. And yet, even as it melts, the ice keeps its mystery. Beneath kilometers of white silence lies terrain that no light has touched since the dawn of humanity. Mountains, valleys, and riverbeds that preserve a version of Earth untouched by civilization. It is a world both ancient and unborn, suspended between memory and potential. Perhaps this is why Antarctica feels less like a place than an idea that the unknown still exists, and that wonder, once found, can never be entirely lost. Each discovery brings the continent closer to the world, and yet its essence remains untouchable. It has become a symbol of everything that resists simplification: beauty beyond use, danger without malice, isolation without loneliness. In that sense, Antarctica is not humanity's opposite, but its reflection. It reveals what we are without cities, without noise, without heat, a species defined by curiosity and fragility. We go there to study, to measure, to know. But what we find again and again is ourselves. When the night ends after months of darkness and the first light returns, the ice glows from within like stained glass. The horizon bleeds gold, the air trembles, and for a few minutes the whole world seems to awaken from a long sleep. The scientists who step outside their stations to witness it describe an emotion that language cannot contain, something between gratitude and fear. The silence deepens and the light spreads. Perhaps that is Antarctica's final lesson, that in the most desolate place on Earth, creation never truly ceases. The ice does not only conceal, it renews. It watches the world burn and freeze and burn again, holding memory without judgment. And so, the last frontier remains what it has always been, a mirror of our longing, our fear, our wonder. The myths have changed, but the mystery endures. Beneath the weight of its silence, the Earth's oldest continent whispers a truth older than science or faith. Nothing is ever truly lost. It is only waiting beneath the ice. Antarctica stands apart, not because it is unknown, but because it refuses to be possessed. Every empire has reached for it. Every generation has rewritten its purpose. It has been imagined as paradise, as prison, as laboratory, as tomb. And yet through all of it, the myths of philosophers, the obsessions of explorers, the ambitions of nations, the ice has remained unyielding. It neither gives nor takes. It remembers. The frozen continent is not the end of the world. It is the world in its most honest form, stripped of distraction, reduced to what endures. Beneath its miles of ice lies the planet as it once was, the raw foundation of continents long fractured. Every ridge, every buried valley, every frozen lake is a relic of the Earth before story began. What we call exploration is in truth remembrance. We return to the south to remember what the planet has been trying to tell us since it cooled from fire. Scientists speak of data, the carbon signatures locked in ancient snow, the shifting rhythms of glaciers that mark the planet's breath. But behind their measurements is a subtler truth. The ice does not only record time, it shapes it. Every storm that sweeps across the plateau carries a flake of memory, another layer of the world's heartbeat laid down and hidden. The continent is not dead. It is writing, slowly, in frost and silence. And yet, even as we uncover its story, we risk erasing it. Each decade, the edges of Antarctica retreat a little farther. The great ice shelves, Ross, Larsen, Amory, fracture into the sea with the sound of continents breaking. The fragments drift northward, glowing blue beneath the sun, melting into the same ocean that defines our climate and sustains our cities. We watch this from afar, measuring rise and fall, but numbers cannot express what it means. The oldest memory of the planet is disappearing before we have finished reading it. The paradox is painful. In knowing Antarctica more intimately than ever before, we are hastening its undoing. Our satellites, our stations, our ships, the instruments of revelation, have become witnesses to loss. Each drill that bores into the ice also hears the faint hiss of ancient air escaping into the modern sky. It is the sound of history exhaling. And yet, even now, the ice does not surrender its mystery. Deep beneath the buried mountains and frozen lakes, instruments detect strange magnetic patterns and gravitational anomalies, signals that science can measure but not yet fully interpret. To the imagination, they echo the oldest myths. The southern continent as cradle of forgotten worlds, as vault of knowledge, as sleeping realm beneath the earth's skin. We know better than to believe these legends literally, yet they persist because they speak to something deeper. They remind us that mystery is not an error in understanding, but the essence of it. For centuries, Antarctica has been the projection of our desires. The Greeks' need for balance, the Renaissance dream of completion, the explorers' pursuit of glory, the Cold War's hunger for power, the modern scientists' search for truth. Each age has found in the ice what it needed most. Perhaps that is its final power, to reflect us back at ourselves. To walk on the polar plateau is to confront that reflection directly. There is no color there, only gradations of white and shadow. The air has no scent. The horizon is a perfect circle, unbroken by tree or hill. In that emptiness, the boundary between land and sky dissolves, and the self begins to dissolve with it. The silence is not absence, but fullness, a sound so vast it consumes thought. Those who have wintered there say that after enough time, one begins to feel the presence of the past pressing upward from beneath the feet, as if the ice itself were conscious. In that silence, myth and science merge. The ancient belief in a southern world of purity, the explorer's dream of reaching the end of everything, the modern quest for knowledge, all become one act of reverence. The continent is not a secret waiting to be revealed. It is a question that cannot be answered. The more precisely we measure it, the more infinite it becomes. There is a moment at the end of every polar summer when the sky grows pale and the sun dips below the horizon for the last time. The world dims into cobalt blue, and the long night begins. The scientists gather outside their stations to watch the final light vanish. For months afterward, they will see no dawn, only the aurora, green ribbons of plasma folding and twisting across the heavens. In those hours, they say, the silence changes. It becomes thicker, heavier, alive. You feel it not in your ears, but in your bones. It is the sound of the planet turning. That silence holds all the ages of the earth. The forests that once covered the southern land, the seas that flooded it, the glaciers that consumed it, the explorers who vanished within it, all are present in that hush. It is not emptiness, it is totality. And as the ice continues to melt, the world begins to understand that this silence is not eternal. The continent is speaking in the only language it knows, the cracking of glaciers, the thunder of ice shelves breaking into the sea. Its warnings are not shouted, they are whispered, slow and inevitable. One day, the last wall of ice will collapse. Rivers will carve new paths through the buried valleys. The ancient land beneath will emerge again, green and breathing as it was before the age of frost. To the people of that future world, the myths we tell today of explorers, of secrets, of frozen civilizations will sound like half-remembered dreams. They will inherit a continent that once held the memory of all time, and they will have to decide whether to preserve it or repeat its forgetting. Perhaps that is Antarctica's purpose, not to conceal what came before, but to test what will come next. It is both prophecy and mirror. It shows us what happens when we mistake mastery for understanding, when we forget that knowledge itself can be destructive. But even in that future, long after the ice retreats and the seas reshape the coasts of the world, Antarctica will not be gone. The glaciers that melt into the ocean will rise again as clouds, fall again as snow, return again as memory. The cycle will continue. The planet will begin again as it always has, writing itself anew. And somewhere in the depths of that renewal, perhaps a few fragments of the ancient ice will remain, buried deep, untouched, holding within them the last breath of a world that was both our cradle and our mirror. Those who find them will hold in their hands more than frozen water. They will hold the echo of the first storm, the scent of the first rain, the shadow of the first forest. They will hear, faintly, the same sound that has always filled the southern silence, the murmur of a living planet asking us to listen. For that is what Antarctica has been all along, not a secret to uncover, but a voice to hear. A voice that says, again and again, through time and ice and wind, remember.